I want to thank you all for being here. I am Vern Pierson. I'm the elected district attorney here in El Dorado County, and seated and speaking here this morning, in addition, is my longtime friend, Anne-Marie Schubert, the district attorney of Sacramento County, and we additionally have a representative of the Innocence Project who's also here, and will speak in terms of the events of the last several weeks, days, and going back to the tragic events of July 7th, 1985, and the circumstances that led to this, led to Ricky Davis's wrongful conviction, his exoneration and finding of factual innocence earlier this morning, as well as an arrest that took place on Tuesday afternoon. So
I apologize really quick. The second person's had I need to switch mics. Sorry about that.
that's all right.
Yeah. I don't know. It's getting interference.
That works. I want to start with this and just pause for a moment, because I think this quote kind of encapsulates the status of law enforcement and the status of investigation, going from back when this crime first took place to the circumstances that resulted in the actual solving of the crime in the last several days. Should have a video playing. Richard, why don't you just come over and do it?
One after another, huh? Right.
I understand Bill Gates had this happen to him one time.
Well,
That's what this is, Richard.
give me a minute. And I'll,
My apologies. We'll just get started in just a moment.
In the early morning hours of July 7th, 1985, Ricky Davis and Connie Dahl called to report the murder of 54-year-old Jane Hylton at a house in El Dorado Hills, California. Hylton had been stabbed 29 times and had a bite mark on her left shoulder. Hylton's body appeared to have been moved, and the crime scene appeared staged. The 3 occupants of the house at the time law enforcement arrived were interviewed by detectives. Ricky Davis and Connie Dahl reported discovering Hylton's body after returning from a party in the Cameron Park area. Hylton's then 13-year-old daughter stated she had left the residence that night and identified 3 teenage boys that she had encountered at a park. She identified them as Calvin, Michael, and Steve or Brian. No charges were brought following the initial investigation in 1985. the case was reopened in 1999. All of the 3 occupants were re-interviewed several times. During an interview characterized as extremely accusational and suggestive, Connie Dahl asserted for the first time that she, Ricky Davis, and the victim's 13-year-old daughter participated in the murder, and that she, Connie, bit the victim during the violent struggle. Charges were filed, and Connie Dahl entered into an immunity agreement and testified against Ricky Davis in July of 2005. The jury found Ricky guilty of murder. Since that time, Ricky has maintained his innocence. In 2012, District Attorney Vern Pierson and the Northern California Innocence Project agreed to submit the evidence for additional forensic testing. In 2014, the Sacramento District Attorney's Crime Lab identified an unknown male DNA profile from saliva on the victim's nightgown in the area of the bite mark. In 2018, the Northern California Innocence Project brought a motion for a new trial premised on the unknown male DNA profile and the coercive interrogation of Connie Dahl. The Honorable Judge Kenneth Malikian heard the evidence and ordered a new trial. In 2019, the El Dorado County District Attorney and the Sacramento County District Attorney worked to identify the unknown male DNA profile by using genetic genealogy. The use of genetic genealogy, thus far, has helped solve dozens of cold case homicides. Investigators and the Sacramento District Attorney's Crime Lab combined the sciences of forensic DNA and genealogy to use genetic genealogy to solve crimes with evidence from an unknown DNA sample. From the unknown sample, they created a genetic profile and searched for similar profiles that would indicate relatives. Then, they used that information to develop a family tree for the suspect. This can lead investigators to identify an individual in the family tree who may be the source of the crime scene DNA or the unknown DNA profile. Then investigators can use traditional forensics to confirm the suspect's identity. Using this new technology, the DNA profile was identified as belonging to one of the 3 individuals identified by first name only by the victim's 13-year-old daughter in 1985. The 3 males who were described by the victim's daughter have been located. One is deceased and one is in custody. On February 12, 2020, the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office filed a motion to dismiss charges against Ricky Davis. The District Attorney's Office is still in the process of investigating this case in the pursuit of justice.
Okay, thank you, and we'll be releasing at the conclusion of that video, and if there's any, obviously we'll answer any questions about it. I can tell you in my 28 years as a prosecutor, this case undoubtedly, for me personally, is 2 of the most dramatic extremes that you can experience. On one hand, a person, Ricky Davis, that was falsely accused, brought to trial, convicted, and has spent the last 15 some years in custody for a crime that I can tell you in all confidence he did not commit. It's not a matter of we don't have sufficient evidence to move forward on it or to proceed to a new trial. It's in all confidence, he did not commit this crime and was not responsible for it. Instead, there is another individual who is now in custody, and as the video indicated, he was one of the individuals that was referred to by Autumn back in 1985 and continued forward in her various statements regarding it. So on one hand, we have the system working in the worst possible way, but on the other hand, we have the evolution of both technology in terms of genetic genealogy, as well as what I would characterize the science of interviewing and appropriate modern science-based techniques in terms of eliciting information from individuals. So I want to recognize a number of different individuals that brought us here today to this, including Elizabeth Wilder from Cal OES, Cindy Berta from also Cal OES, Jay Linden, one of our deputy DAs, Joe Ramsey, an investigator with our office, John Gaines, another investigator here, Sandra Rivas, a crime analyst, Kirk Campbell from Sacramento County DA's office, Monica Sawalski from the Sacramento DA's office, and Angela Shaw, as well as a number of different allied law enforcement agencies who assisted. Last night, I was with the investigators interviewing a witness at the Folsom Police Department a day before in the Roseville Police Department, and I can tell you that we've had extensive cooperation from Sacramento County DA's office on down to bring us to this point. It's a surreal thing in a sense, because I'm not, as I said before, I'm not telling you that we can't prove it. I'm telling you Ricky Davis was wrongfully convicted. He was convicted as a product of what I would best characterize as overly aggressive interrogation technique that was confession driven. In other words, the interrogators that were trained, and many other law enforcement in the state of California are trained that way, to aggressively go after seeking a confession as opposed to seeking information and seeing where the information leads them. I'm happy to say that the two investigators that were involved in this have been trained on science-based interrogation techniques or interviewing techniques stemming from an organization that is known as the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, which is a research-based interrogation and interviewing type technique we can talk about more later. So you have two different extremes leading to this next one. So, as I indicated, the exoneration and the new arrest related to Jane Hylton's actual murder is a product of the science-based interviewing and genetic genealogy. And specifically, I've asked DA Anne-Marie Schubert to specifically talk about the work that her lab assisted with us in this over the last several years.
So decades really before forensic DNA evidence was ever used to identify somebody who was guilty of a crime or to actually free someone who was not, Nobel Peace Prize winner Mahatma Gandhi said, "Truth never damages a cause that is just." I'll say it again. Truth never damages a cause that is just. DNA evidence, in my opinion, is the greatest tool ever given to law enforcement to find the truth, no matter what that truth is. To identify the guilty, to exonerate the innocent. I've known this personally for 25 years, since my first DNA case in the mid-90s. In 2004, Melissa O'Connell from the Innocence Project here in Northern California, along with the El Dorado County DA's office, came to us, to our crime lab director at the time, Jill Spriggs, to ask us to consider doing post-conviction DNA testing on the Ricky Davis case. And many people might think about what I'm about to say is somewhat surprising, is that we've had a long-standing relationship with the Innocence Project, as well as Melissa O'Connell. I'd like to believe that we're always willing to listen, and when appropriate, to do testing for a client that they represent. That's what we should do after all. Late 2014, as DA Pierson mentioned, our crime lab, the Sac County DA crime lab, began an extremely meticulous process of examining every piece of evidence in this case. As some folks have described to me, meeting after meeting after meeting with our lab folks, with the DA's office here in El Dorado, with the Innocence Project, asking those questions. What do we have? What does it mean? What can we do? countless hours by Angel Shaw, countless hours, mapping items of evidence section by section, inch by inch, in the hopes of finding what some might say is a needle, something that belonged to the perpetrator, the actual perpetrator of this horrific crime. And with that tedious work by the lab, the DNA emerged, and that was not Ricky Davis. Armed with that information, we know that the Innocence Project went to the El Dorado County Courthouse and asked the judge to reopen that case. And then in May of 2018, the court ordered a hearing of which our crime lab analyst, Angel Shaw, testified. And then in April of 2019, that judge reversed the conviction and ordered a new trial. April of 2019. Within 2 weeks of that order, Vern Pierson came down to our office, the DA's office in Sacramento, and asked a question. Could we use this new tool that had just been used less than a year earlier, the same tool used to identify the alleged Golden State Killer? Could we use this tool? After all, it was used in that case, and since that time has been used in really upwards of probably close to 80 cases across this country to identify rapists and murderers. And in only one case so far had it been used to exonerate an individual. That was in Idaho. Could we use this tool here for the first time in California to potentially free a man? And the question was very simple to ask. Of course we should. And so it began in May of 2019, a partnership that was on a mission, one mission, to find the truth. Who did that DNA belong to? That partnership involved, obviously, the critical component of the DA's office here in El Dorado, our crime lab, private laboratories who specialize in the specific testing that we need for genealogy, private companies that have public genealogy sites that provide the critical link that develops what I call the genetic leads to help us find that truth. I must say, and it cannot go unsaid, that law enforcement's ability to find that truth, to identify the guilty, and yes, to exonerate the innocent with investigative genetic genealogy rests not only with the public's trust, but it also rests with a very clear understanding of one fact. When crime scene DNA evidence is uploaded to a public genealogy site, law enforcement, like anybody else that uses those sites, does not get access to anybody's personal genetic information. They do not get their personal DNA profiles. They get the same information that anyone using that site would get, a list of potential relatives, as I call them, genetic leads, that may lead them to the answer of who does that crime scene profile belong to. And it's with that genetic lead and with passion and persistence by law enforcement that they can then embark on what we call a tree building to identify those individuals in that family tree that may lead us to the answer. And in this particular case, countless hours by folks that have already been mentioned from my office, Lieutenant Kirk Campbell, Monica Zykowski, Joe Ramsey from El Dorado DA's office, Sandra Rivas as well. Countless hours meticulously taking those leads and building that tree. It needs to be made very clear that without investigative genetic genealogy, we would not be here today. This is the first case in California and only the second in this country where investigative genetic genealogy has not only led to the freeing of an individual from prison for a crime he did not commit, but the identification of the true source, and as we now know, the arrest of the person that did have that DNA. It freed Ricky Davis. It identified the other person. Just last weekend, I watched a national television show that questioned law enforcement's use of public genealogy sites to solve crimes, like the Golden State Killer. I wonder where those voices will be today in learning that this same tool that has been used so often now to solve violent crime has now been used to free an innocent man. It must be remembered that this is not a tool of conviction, it is a tool of justice. And there's no question that this was a just cause. There are so many people that participated in this just cause that I think I would be remiss for not thanking them, as Vern did. The Innocence Project and Ricky Davis for trusting us and asking for our help for not only seeking the truth, but actually finding it. To our crime lab, Sacramento DA's crime lab, Jill Spriggs, who was the lab director at the time, Chip Pollock, who's the lab director now, Angel Shaw, who spent a lot of time searching for that truth. To our investigators, the investigators, Kirk and Monica, Joe Ramsey, Sandra Rivas, to build those trees. To the private labs that use the most advanced technology we have to develop the type of DNA profile we needed to be able to actually upload it. And to that private genealogy database for recognizing that this tool, this new tool, will in fact advance human rights to identify the guilty and exonerate the innocent. And without a doubt, the amazing work of the El Dorado DA's office team of investigators led by Vern Pierson to get us to that place. Let's end with this. Investigative genetic genealogy, just like traditional DNA, is about one thing: finding the truth no matter what it is. The victim, her daughter, they deserve that. Ricky Davis deserves that, and our community deserves that as well. So thank you to everybody that was part of this just cause.
Thank you, Anne Marie. I'm going to introduce our next speaker by telling you a brief story from 2 nights ago at about, I think it was 6 or 7 p.m. Myself and my chief investigator, Jeff Dreyer, went over to the El Dorado County Jail and met with Ricky Davis and his attorney, Missy Vanderbiver, had a local attorney come to, because she was out of town, and meet with Ricky face to face. I told Ricky that that I had met several years ago with Melissa O'Connell, and she was very persuasive and persistent about his innocence. He obviously professed his innocence at that same time. And I told her then that I was troubled by the way the original interrogations, or not the original, but about the third or fourth interrogation of Connie Dahl, was troubled by the way they were conducted, but he was in fact convicted. And before we could really do anything with the case, I needed a direction. I told her, and I believe I gave her a commitment that we have honored. If you give us some information, if you give us evidence and point us in a direction, we will investigate the case as though it's an unsolved homicide and put the full resources that we have available to us, that also including the Sacramento County DA's office, to investigate it just like that, which is what happened. And over the last several weeks in particular, there's been an exhaustive amount of efforts of investigators working basically 7 days a week, following up on this to make sure that we got to this point. I explained that to Ricky and told him where we were on it, and he said to me, "Vern, I didn't do it." And I said, "Ricky, I have to tell you with all sincerity, I believe you. And we're very close to proving it." And so with that, I'd ask Melissa O'Connell from the Innocence Project who started this process moving forward in reevaluating this case, to come up and speak with you.
I've already cried like 20 times in court. I'm more emotional than Ricky today, which I wish Ricky was here right now. We're still working on getting him released, but to say that this has been a day that has been long overdue is an understatement. Back in 2009, our project received a National Institute of Justice grant that allowed us to do DNA testing in cases. And Ricky's case was one of our first back in 2010 that we started looking into. And as Mr. Pierson highlighted, it was the interrogation methods that were used when detectives, the cold case detectives, were interrogating Connie Dahl 14 years after the murder that got our attention. Those of us that are in the innocence community study these things, and we focus on what leads to wrongful convictions, and the interrogation methods were high risk and were concerning to us that they likely resulted in a false confession or a false implication. And when we started dissecting the case and rebuilding it from the bottom up, with the thought in our mind that Ricky was innocent at that time, which is what we ask all law enforcement to do when they look at our cases, is really give them back that presumption of innocence and look at this case from the bottom up, and that's what we do. And when we did that, we realized that there was one piece of physical evidence in Connie's interrogations that we believed would establish whether or not she was telling the truth, and it was a fact that was fed to her by law enforcement. And they said to her, "Were you aware that the victim was bit?" And she said no, and through extensive interrogations over the course of almost 2 years, she admitted that she was the one that bit the victim on her left shoulder. And that was it for us. And that was the physical evidence that we knew if we could DNA test that bite mark, then we could prove Ricky's innocence, because Connie Dahl was the linchpin in his conviction. And it wasn't that easy, and Angel Shaw will tell you that, because we learned that the bite mark actually wasn't swabbed back in 1985, but we had Miss Hylton's nightgown, and the work of Angel Shaw and the Sacramento County Crime Lab in this case was remarkable. Ms. Shaw is meticulous and brilliant and professional, and it was meeting after meeting with both myself and the DA's office, telling us every step of her testing, down to the point where she had to draw the patterns of the victim's nightgown to figure out what was the front from the back, to make sure that when she found an unidentified male DNA profile in a particular quadrant of the nightgown, that it was the back left shoulder. And that's what it was. And that profile was also redundant under the victim's severely injured hands, demonstrating how much she fought for her life before she succumbed to her injuries. And at that point, we knew we had the evidence to prove Ricky's innocence. What's hard for us as an innocence project, I think, is we've believed since 2014 that we had the evidence that established that Ricky was innocent, and we've long believed in his innocence. That's our threshold for when we pursue our cases. And that's when we went to the DA's office with this evidence, because we wanted justice for Ricky and we wanted justice for Ms. Hylton's family. The genealogy in this case has been a gift. Ricky was postured for retrial, and I think what's hard to think about is knowing that one of the three men, or boys at the time, that Autumn was with that night is deceased now. And if it had been that boy who was the source of the DNA, I don't know that we'd be standing here, and I'm very fearful that Ricky would have been wrongfully convicted again. And I say that, and I want to recognize Ricky's trial lawyer right now, Missy Vandeviver, who's not up here right now, but I want to recognize her because she kept Ricky calm and recreated his trust that he might have been vindicated in the second trial because of the DNA evidence. We are so grateful to the DA's office and to the Sacramento Crime Lab for taking this to the next level and doing this investigation, and by the grace of whoever we all believe in, that the gentleman who was the source of this DNA profile was still alive and we could compare the DNA to it, and Ricky got the justice that he has deserved coming for the last 15 years today. And nothing will be greater than this moment than to see him walk out a free man hopefully in the next 5 hours. Or in time to go grab a pizza, which is what he would like to eat today. So thank you to El Dorado County DA's office in Sacramento for your continued work on this, and thank you for Ms. Vandeviver, who I can't find right now, and certainly to Ms. Shaw, because we would not be up here today but for your tenacity. So thank you.
Okay, with that, I would open it to questions, and if you just identify who you want to ask the question, just let me know, and we'll try to do the best we can.
I want to ask you.
Yes, sir.
Who's the suspect? Is it Michael Green? And how do you get from Michael, the kid in the park, to Michael Green?
Well, that's a lot of detective work to do that, including genetic genealogy. I can tell you that he was a juvenile at the time. He was not an adult, and for that reason, there's some certain legal complications in terms of publicly identifying him. I can tell you that Autumn used the name Michael Green as being one of the individuals she was with that night. Ironically, I think when I spoke with Ricky the other day, he mentioned Connie as being fed a story and being made to tell a story, and that Autumn was the only person, I think the expression she used, the only person that stayed true to what actually happened other than himself. So I can't go into specific details from a legal standpoint. I can tell you she used the name Michael Green. You heard the names, and there is an individual in custody by that name in another jurisdiction at our direction.
Can you say
Does that
more?
answer?
He's in custody here, isn't he?
He's not in custody here yet. I don't believe he's been transported yet.
Where'd you arrest him?
He was arrested and taken into custody in Roseville and interviewed at that time.
And can you tell us anything about the interview? I mean, decades later.
Well, understand that we have while we're ending one criminal case here, in that being Ricky Davis with his exoneration and finding factual innocence, there is another criminal prosecution that's beginning, and the investigation's ongoing. So I want to be careful about what I say specifically about that part of the case.
Would he have to be, sorry, John Thompson, a couple of questions. Would he have to be, you mentioned complications, tried under some sort of juvenile prescription because that was at the time, or how does that work? Can you explain it, even hypothetically?
In just the very general sense that because at the time, 1985, essentially what would happen is a filing would take, for a juvenile, even in a cold case, many years later when the person's in their 50s, the case would have to be initially filed in juvenile court, which is typically confidential with initial filing, and then there would be what's called a transfer hearing to adult court, which we're confident will take place.
And for Ms. Schubert, you mentioned that this is the second case. It was unclear. It's the second case to exonerate or is it the second case where both exonerated and implicated somebody else? Can you expand on just the parameters of that?
There's one case in Idaho, it's the Angie Dodge case, and it was, I believe, both an exoneration and an identification and prosecution of the individual that was led to genealogy.
And do you know if this technology has been used to exonerate others, even if it did not also implicate?
I believe that these are the only two cases in the country of an exoneration using the genetic genealogy.
Vern, can you elaborate on the other two suspects here? You said three may have been involved in this?
Well, and without getting into all the specifics because of the pending criminal, the ongoing criminal investigation and prosecution, there was Autumn used the name of Calvin, and he is deceased. And there was another individual that she referred to by Steve. She was unsure about that name and didn't know him. That individual was interviewed last night, and we believe that he was not a precipient witness to the incident itself, but was a witness to the immediate or somewhat immediate aftermath.
Did your investigators,
Can I ask a question? Can you confirm that there was a court hearing this morning and just talk about what happened during that court hearing?
Yes. There was a court hearing this morning in which we filed a motion to dismiss the case against Ricky Davis and asked the court to make a finding of factual innocence. That took place this morning. He was represented by counsel. I was present as well as a number of other individuals from the DA's office. Judge Malikian heard that and made those findings.
Was Mr. Davis present?
Yes, he was present.
Can you describe any emotion, if at all, that was expressed on his part?
I would defer to his counsel to do that if they wish to.
Yes, Mr. Davis. This is not an Mr. Davis was very emotional. He got to hug his mom for the first time in court today in a very, very long time, and other family members. Ms. Vandeviver and myself were very emotional with him. And he also received a handshake from one of the El Dorado County District Attorneys as well this morning, which he very much appreciated.
What is the reason why it will take 5 hours for him to leave?
That was me being hopeful. It just takes some time for individuals to be processed out of local and state custody. Thank you. Where was he? He was in local county jail as of late, yes.
Yes, sir.
did your investigation follow basically the same path as the East Area Rapist and NorCal suspects? I mean, did you sit on the suspect for a couple of days to collect DNA that you could use to compare to what the lab came up with?
I don't want to comment on the specific investigative techniques that were used. However, you're very well acquainted with the techniques that we would typically do, and there is a protocol that we follow, and Anne-Marie may wish to speak to further, but it is law enforcement, I think, is wise to follow a protocol of using genetic genealogy as an investigative lead, and then going and taking other significant investigative steps to verify that lead, and that was done in this case.
And did all that DNA come from the nightgown where the shoulder was bitten? Was it saliva on the nightgown, or?
Well, I'll just say in terms of this, it was addressed, and we can talk about it, and Melissa may want to come and talk about it more specifically. So there was as she referred to, and it's on the video, there was a bite mark on the victim's left shoulder. She was stabbed a total of 29 times. It was a horrific struggle that she fought for her life. There's no question about that. And in the area of the bite mark, on her, by focusing in on the clothing that she was wearing at the time, And looking at that specific quadrant, the lab was able to look at it and isolate an area that was originally perceived to be unusable for DNA because of earlier technology, that it was a mixture essentially of blood and saliva. The Sacramento lab, being one of the premier labs in this area, was able to separate that and identify it as a male DNA, and that happened a few years ago. But that was an unknown male DNA profile. And then subsequent to that, that work was focusing in on looking at that profile and whether or not using genetic genealogy to identify that person. And I think Melissa alluded to, there's a matching, not a sufficient level for us to use it forensically, but a matching profile in the fingernail scrapings for the victim as well.
And I take it that,
I'm sorry, Susan.
Go ahead.
What can you say at this point about what led up to this involving Autumn and the 3 boys?
I don't want to say specifics. There are still some things that, questions that are unanswered. We know that there was an interaction that was friendly between them during the course of that evening, in particular with one of the individuals. And, I don't want to go into all specifics, but a lot of this is public. Much of what Autumn said initially, nearly everything, was our investigators, we have the DNA evidence as a forensic lead, the genetic genealogy. But basically what they ended up doing was going back and validating everything that Autumn originally said, her original statement, and invalidating everything that Connie said in her trial testimony.
For those who aren't aware, what was Autumn's statement at the time?
Her statement was that she, essentially, that they had just moved to that house. They was temporarily staying at a temporary residence at that location. She had just come back from a trip out of town, and we found out that they were staying at this residence, and wasn't necessarily happy about it. Had a conversation with her mother about it, and then she went out for a walk. Ricky Davis and Connie had gone out to a party. At some point in time, she encountered these 3 teenage boys. It was a very friendly interaction between them. She decided to go back to the house where she was staying with her mom. She took a shower, changed clothes, and essentially did what 13-year-olds sometimes do. She lied to her mother and said she was going to go spend the night at someone else's house. She was really going out to meet with these 3 boys, really one of the 3 boys. But beyond that, we can prove that all happened. And beyond that, I don't want to go into the exact specifics of what occurred following that.
We don't believe Autumn was home when this happened.
We don't believe so. And I don't want to hesitate and sound like maybe we think we do. There are some things, and candidly, the way some of the interrogation techniques that have been talked about, her memory is, this is 35 years ago, she was a 13-year-old, that she did walk in and see her mom in the condition that she was in, a horrific scene. I don't think that her memory, as far as we can prove by investigation forensically, is pretty darn accurate, but it's not perfect. And I'm sorry, I think I was answering your question. I may have answered it.
She's never been a person interested in this at all either.
No, she was. To be fair, during the first trial that took place, she was criticized and essentially accused of being present when it took place, maybe not being a participant, but being present at the time of the homicide. And her testimony saying about the 3 individuals and that Ricky and Connie had been gone and not involved in it, her testimony was what we call in the legal industry impeached with she had given the name of Michael Green. They went to the high school she went, Oak Ridge High School, identified an individual by that same name, brought him to trial and said, do you know Autumn? And he says, yes, she goes to the same school as me. did you come in contact with her that night? No, I did not. I was not in contact with her. She's crazy, she's saying that. So basically, she was made to appear as though she was lying about that, when in fact she was telling the truth. It was the wrong Michael Green that they contacted. And I would say, in fairness to her, I mean, she's been through a tremendous amount. There are always, in these cases, when we look back on them in the light of day after the fact, but in complete fairness to her, from the very beginning, she said, go get some yearbooks. If you find the yearbooks, I will be able to identify the individuals. And up until Joe Ramsey and John Gaines went and got the yearbooks and showed them to her, no one had ever done that. And she was able to identify the people in this. So, and that's to her credit in helping solve this ultimately. Yes, sir.
Is Steve in custody in connection to this case, or was he already in custody?
No, Steve is not in custody. Steve is a witness that we interviewed last night.
Okay, so one is dead,
Right.
Michael Green is in custody, or
Right.
whoever's in custody, and Steve is out.
Right.
Okay.
Can you say if Steve is cooperating with you?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt earlier. So just to be clear, I mean, would have made presumably life simpler if you had a match from the fingernail and the saliva DNA to somebody, and it wasn't that simple. You had to then do build the family tree that led you to somebody, led you to
Right.
somebody, led you to this.
Like in so many of these cases, what happens, like a fingerprint, if someone's been previously arrested, there's a record of their fingerprint. If someone's previously been arrested for certain crimes, there is a DNA profile that's uploaded into CODIS. When, during the course of an investigation, if we identify a profile we believe is associated with the crime, much like in this one, you run it through CODIS and hope for a hit on it. That happened in 2004, 2005, and no, 2014, 2015. I can find the exact date if you need it, but did not come back with a positive hit. And I should say, and thank you for reminding me, when I met with Ricky the other night, you know, it's an interesting conversation for someone to meet with someone as a prosecutor and realize that this person has in fact been falsely accused and convicted and incarcerated. And in talking to him about it, he said a number of things. I mean, he knew that we had made a commitment that we would follow up on it. And he made reference to the amount of time. And I had to tell him, in all candor, if this investigation had moved forward years ago, the technology did not exist, the techniques did not exist that were employed in this case to unwind it the way that we were able to do it now. So I wish it had occurred sooner, and we could have gotten him out of custody sooner and identified, but the practical reality is it's only been the last really year and a half, 2 years, that the genetic genealogy to identify somebody under these circumstances has been in existence. Any additional questions? Sam?
What happened, was it one interrogator in 1999 who introduced the concept that she'd been bitten to Connie? Or was it two?
I think there was 2 detectives involved in that.
So what happened to that?
And they're both retired and not in law enforcement today.
I'm sorry, they're both retired?
Yeah.
Okay. I was thinking you said earlier that they had been retrained to do techniques. Was that other?
No. What I was referring to is that the type of interrogation that I think Melissa referred to it as high risk for false confessions, things like that. That type of technique has, I think maybe they were more aggressive than most detectives are trained, but that type of technique has been prevalent in the 30s, 40s, and 50s up to now. I believe there's an increasing, I know that there is a forward-moving trend of conducting interrogations based on science of what actually works in the course of interviewing someone, and focusing the interrogation on developing information and then letting the information lead to whatever conclusion it does lead. So that's a different type, but those 2 have been retired for several years now.
So you were just saying detectives in general now use?
Not in general. Detectives are beginning to. I can tell you that the 2 that are involved directly in this case, they have been trained in that matter. One with LAPD and the other one with NYPD.
Will Ricky Davis get any type of compensation? And he lost more than a decade of his life. Or how will he go back into society?
Yeah.
Are you gonna assist him on that?
Yeah, the court made a finding at the end, and I didn't recall the specific code section it applies to, having to do with that. I'm confident that he will undoubtedly seek compensation for the amount of the time that he was incarcerated and the false conviction. And so beyond that, I can't really, I'm confident that he will ultimately be compensated.
But there's no number at this time.
No.
What, is there a motive to the murder?
Because of, as I indicated before, because of the ongoing investigation and prosecution, I don't want to comment on the specifics of what we know right now as it relates to motive. Any other questions, or we'll wrap up?
Is her daughter still a person of interest in this case?
Autumn?
Yeah.
No, she is not. Any other questions? Last chance. All right, thank you all very much. As I said, the video will be posted on our Facebook. If you need additional information, I know the number of people that are involved in it are here present. I can't say whether or not they'll actually speak to you if you want to do an interview with them, but they are, and thank you all for coming.